So, we've taken a deeper dive into how Macedonians of the early 1800s actually saw themselves, with songs and folk stories about Alexander the Great as well as other ancient Macedonians. We surveyed some ancient Macedonian cultural practices and found them still present in modern-day Macedonia. And finally, we took a look at some archaic Macedonian vocab as well as Hellenic still in use in our present-day language as well. All these signs would point to at least partial descent from the ancient populations that inhabited the Balkans, like the Macedonians. But none of this will matter to the Greeks and Bulgars flooding the comment section, because for them the answer is always one and the same. You are Slavic migrants who invaded the Balkans in the 7th century, so therefore you cannot have any connection to the ancient Macedonians for that reason alone. What they reference here is essentially the Slavic migration model of the 19th century, a theory which states that not only was ancient Macedonia, as well as most of the Balkans, essentially void of any native population by the 6th and 7th century, but a massive deluge of Slavic migrants from behind the Carpathian Mountains came in and demographically replaced the entire population. And I know, this must be hard to believe, but the commenters that post this canned response every 20 minutes, they actually haven't taken the time to review some of the more recent scholarly criticism and challenges against the long-held Slavic migration theory. So today, we will do just that. We will take a look at 5 major flaws with the Slavic migration theory so you can decide for yourself on its merits. Trust me, this is the video you're going to want to rewatch many times in the future. So, before we get started, just make sure you subscribe if you haven't already, and drop me a comment and tell me what you think down below. And without any further ado, let's get started. The first problem rests with the name Slav itself, which comes to us from the Greek sklaveni. Now, the problem here is that this name is actually an exonym, meaning it's a name given to a group by an outside group. Whoever or whatever was this group that showed up on the banks of the Danube River in the 6th century during Emperor Justinian's reign, we simply do not know how they called themselves in their own language. We know what the Byzantines called them, that's sklaveni, and this seems to have been more or less an umbrella term for a diverse group of people, including some Scythians, Sarmatians, Iranians, as well as Germanic groups in that hodgepodge as well. So at the very best, if this described a group of people who spoke the same language, which as you will see shortly, we're not even sure of, then it would mirror the modern day exonym Hispanic, used to describe all the Spanish speakers from the Spanish themselves down to the Nicaraguans. Now, imagine how absurd it would sound if in 1500 years we thought all these people were ethnic Hispanics, all sharing a common ethnic heritage and being of one stock. Now, moreover, sklaveni, depending on the author and the context and the time period, could mean different things, ranging anything from political and cultural to just linguistic. Take, for example, the Byzantine chronicler Theophanes of Simocata. Now, he called the Getae, an indigenous Thracian tribe, sklaveni, because of their barbarous and rebellious attitude towards the Romans. So, how could this native Thracian tribe suddenly become an altogether different ethnic group of different ancestry and different origin in what amounts to practically overnight, anthropologically speaking? Now, if you ask the Bulgars, though, that's pretty much exactly what happened in Macedonia, but we know that's not how this works. In fact, this more or less states the tone of what information the Byzantines actually present us about the sklaveni. Most sources from Procopius or the Strategetikon, they were snippets about the Slavs through the lens of Roman military manuals, basically just detailing how they can be defeated. Nothing about their origin, their language, or what they actually called themselves. And furthermore, if this was a group of people called the Skloveni or the Slaveni, as this migration model claims, then we need a satisfactory explanation as to why the Southern Balkans is conspicuously absent of any Slavic place names that would indicate settlement by a group of people calling themselves the Sloveni, like we see in the north with Slovenia, Slovakia, Slavonia, and even the Slovenci in Novgorod. Simply is not there, so much is left to be desired. Now, in addition to not knowing what this group actually referred to themselves in their language or what their identity was, we don't actually know what language they spoke. That's right, folks. We don't actually know what their native language was. But how can this be, though? I mean, don't we have Old Church Slavic as proof of what language they spoke? Actually, not really. Old Church Slavic, as you will know, was codified by St. Cyril, and this was an artificial language created in the 9th century, some 3 centuries after the Sclaveni of the Byzantine sources. It was used to translate the gospel for the Moravians, and later was used to baptize the Rus in modern-day Ukraine. So this wasn't a language that anybody spoke in their primary, mother tongue. We know it was a language that was understood by these people, but as archaeologists like Dr. Florian Kurza will point out, without any definitive written record, this is simply no basis for evidence that this was also a language they spoke in the market to buy a loaf of bread. All we know, at best, is that this was a language they understood. And as we know, populations of the time period were multilingual, with many Slavic tribal leaders having no trouble communicating with Greek or Avar leaders as well. In fact, this leads many to believe that the so-called Slavic language could have simply been a lingua franca used by people of various ethnic origins, as we see traces of Germanic, Iranic, Baltic, Latin, Thracian, among other languages influencing the Slavic language, which based off this would point to a lingua franca being created immediately north of the Danube River. But even this is not actual proof where the actual Slavic tribes that came into the Balkans came from. Again, a lot of uncertainty there, and we really don't know what their actual native language could have been. We just know that this common Slavic came to be a language that was spoken all across Eastern and Central Europe eventually. And Professor Joanna Nichols, she might have put it best. She says some migration took place, but the most parsimonious assumption was that the Slavic expansion was primarily a linguistic spread. And there's a lot more linguistic issues that are used to prove the standard migration model. We know that by the 9th century, the Slavic dialects were remarkably cohesive, enough so that the Slavic spoken in Thessalonica could have still been easily understood by the Moravians when St. Cyril and Methodius undertook their mission there by the 900s. And as Professor Kurta put it, no people that has ever existed on planet Earth has been able to move that area of distance, been in contact with that many people over to what amounts to centuries, and have had their original language remain that intact. Not once, not ever. This is simply not how massive migrations work in reality. Which leads us into the next flaw here, which is archaeological. So, for a Slavic migration on the scale that this theory describes to take place, we of course need to find evidence of it, traces of it, in the archaeological record, as well as the material culture, which would point to a well-defined Slavic group of people. Except, we don't have that. In the nationalist fueled 1800s, where the idea of one people, one language prevailed, a mad dash was initiated by politicians, archaeologists, and linguists alike to find that Slavic homeland, hopefully within their own country's backyards. So, based on a purely linguistic analysis of the Slavic languages, the infamous area of the Pripyat swamps in modern-day Ukraine and part of Poland was chosen as the most probable Slavic homeland. Now, in the absence of any actual written sources, it is extremely problematic to try to use linguistic evidence alone to date a people and their movements, since without the written record, it simply is an assumption that's not supported by actual sources. So what happened during this time period? Well, using an already flimsy foundation to find the so-called Slavic material culture and using the linguistic evidence, they try to find that ground zero. And what the problem here being, though, is the material culture they found and the assemblages that they thought was Slavic doesn't actually show any uniqueness or peculiarity that would point to a definitive identity being Slavic. In fact, some assemblages presented as Slavic, like the sunken houses, they're shown with the Anglo-Saxons all the way in England. And even more so, the more austere and plain pots and pans of the Prague material culture, also presented as Slavic, they only show plainness because of the functionality to their design. There's just no evidence there of a group actually wanting to imprint an identity or a culture in the objects themselves that we would know as Slavic. Now, furthermore, we also have to be careful because the people that happen to have shared the same material culture throughout history, this does not lead to the implication that these are also the same cultural and ethnic background as well, all these people. And if all of this wasn't already on weak enough ground alone, get ready for this. The assemblages found in the Balkans, in the area right along the Danube River where the Byzantines first noted the Sclaveni, they have an earlier accepted date to them than anything found in the Ukraine or Poland by over 100 years. In fact, Italian anthropologist Mario Aline, hey, nice name, he takes it a step further and he says that even in the earliest metallurgical sites labeled as Slavic in the Balkans, not only do they predate those up north, but they're actually identical to the ones coming from Anatolia, where the actual first recorded people came into the Balkans during the Stone Age. So again, continuity there. And even if these cultures that we find are presented as Slavic, even if we accept that as outright, then based on that material culture alone, this Slavic group, we would be led to believe, did not actually spread that much at all, as defined by other instances of that specific material culture, like in places like in Macedonia. And furthermore, in Macedonia, the burial customs there that were practiced, these were actually practiced before and after the so-called Slavic migrations. So they actually stayed intact during this time period. So what this shows us is that the same culture there dominated, at least parts of it, before and after the Slavic migration. So if there was a migration, it would have been smaller in scale than we're led to believe. And these newcomers, they actually would have assimilated to that culture rather than imposing their culture on the natives. And here's something else to consider. A massive migration, presumably caused by natural disasters and invasions from other tribes and people, that would naturally lead us to believe that there would be massive depopulation of the original homeland as the population transferred en masse to their new homes. Well, the exact opposite happened. The populations of Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, not only did they increase in size and population, but they grew so much they had to have their own kingdoms organized there. So again, what evidence do we actually have for a massive migration? Not much in the actual archaeological records. So let's turn to the written record and see what we see there. Now, we briefly touched upon the written record or the lack thereof, but as we saw, the written records only started mentioning these Sclaveni when they started posing a problem to Byzantine rule. And that was when they actually appeared on the banks of the Danube River around the area of southern Romania. No sources indicate a recent arrival of theirs, and in fact, some sources, like the anonymous author of the Miracles of St. Demetrius, he just calls them our Slavic neighbors. Now, could they still have migrated from an earlier place before? Absolutely. No one is discounting this entirely. What I'm saying, though, is that in the written records, we do not have any reliable indicators of where this place might have been and when they actually would have migrated. All we know is that they were first noticed along the Danube River. And here's something else to remember. The earliest recorded settlement in the Balkans in Macedonia was actually in the middle of the 7th century, 200 years after their supposed great move from the Pripyat swamps initially. So for a people fleeing natural disaster and invasions from other tribes, they clearly took their time trying to settle into new and fertile ground. Before that, all sources speak of is just raids and invasions into Byzantine territory, but with the Sclaveni going back to their original homes. And as we said before, by this time Slav or Sclaveni could have meant a lot of different things to a lot of different people depending on the context. But we know, for example, that by the time of the Preslav Literary School in Bulgaria, Slav was still primarily a linguistic category of people. The first time we actually see the Slavs define themselves and their identity is not until the 12th century with Nestor's primary chronicle, written by a group of anonymous writers from the Kievan Rus. However, this is written just for the Rus, not for the Slavs as a whole. In fact, most origin stories written by Slav states, they're only written concerning the dynasty's origin, not the people themselves. In fact, the only one that does give us a definitive answer about the origin of the Slavs is the chronicle itself. And there they said that the Slavs came from Illyricum in the Balkans. Now, this would support Curtis' thesis, but the chronicle is not reliable for its historical accuracy, so we can exclude that. All we're left with again is a big vacuum in the written record of where these Slavs could have come from. If we're to accept the views of YouTube user Alexandros Hillas 300 entirely, then we'll be led to believe that the Slavs not only completely replaced the native population in modern-day Republic of Macedonia, But they also happen to stop right at the Niki Megitlia border crossing, since modern-day Greeks are absolutely exempt from any Slavic heritage. Now, we already discussed in my previous video using Dr. Fine's book how the so-called Slavs, whoever they were, also covered most of Greece from the Peloponnesus down to even the islands. And even the very core of Macedonia in modern-day Greece, that was Slavicized as well. The Byzantine chroniclers, they call Thessaloniki very famously a Roman island in a Slavic sea. But that's not the point here. We know everybody's mixed and we have no problem with that. The point is that the genetic evidence, it does not point to a massive Slavic migration. In fact, the haplogroup R1a, which has been identified by some as the Slavic gene, and I'll explain in a later video why this may even still be on flimsy ground, this R1a gene, if we're to accept this narrative, this is the Slavic gene, and we take a look at its frequency in modern-day Macedonians, then we would see that at best, it ranges from 15 to 20%. That's right, folks, 15 to 20%. The Slavic migration, which apparently dried up riverbeds and destroyed entire fields of grass, left all of a 20% imprint in our genetic heritage. In all those descriptions of the Slavs being a tall people with reddish blonde hair, who does this describe more? An average Macedonian from Bitola or an average Pole from Warsaw? Now, the rest of our heritage, though, that's going to be made up of haplogroups I2, EV13, and J2. There are also some traces of R1b and G2a. Now, a lot of complex things there, but what this is showing us is that there's a higher percentage of pre-Slavic native populations than Slavic, and whatever we're using as the basis for the Slavic ancestry would point to a very small amount of actual Slavic roots. However, it is also important to note that there haven't been many genetic tests done on ancient and medieval populations of the Balkans, so therefore it's not necessarily correct to assume as an overall statement that haplogroups are just a product of certain populations. In reality, haplogroups are a product of prehistoric processes, not ancient and medieval events. So there you go, folks, a jam-packed but hopefully still concise breakdown of the 5 prevailing challenges to the long-held Slavic migration theory. Now, I'm sure you are left with more questions than answers, which is good. You are seeing that there is so much more gray area and debate to these questions of our identity and ancestry than some YouTubers like to admit. You know, like the ones that give you this surface level, 10,000 foot view blanket statement, the Slavs came to the Balkans and Macedonians are extinct, and expect you to swallow it as fact. I will always tell you when there's doubt and uncertainty over some ideas, even the ones that are uncomfortable, because that's how history works. There are seldom, if ever, any definitive answers. But then again, at the end of the day, what exactly happened during the so-called Slavic migration? Well, that can be a good topic for a future video exploring that. However, let's get a taste for what some of the prevailing theories are actually leading us to believe. Professor Gregory, in his book, A History of Byzantium, he states the following. It is now generally agreed that the people who lived in the Balkans after the Slavic invasions were probably, for the most part, the same as those who lived there earlier, though the creation of new political groups and an arrival of a small number of immigrants caused these people to look at themselves as distinct from their neighbors, including the Byzantines. Small number of immigrants? Same people before and after the migrations? What does this all mean about ourselves and our identity? Now, we're really getting into some of the good questions here. But for that, folks, you're going to have to tune in to the next episode of Marius History Talks. So until next time, folks, drop me a line. Let me know what you think about this. Definitely rewatch the video. Follow me on social media. I'll see you again soon. In the meantime, stay safe and keep fighting za Majka Makedonia. Take care, folks.